You and I live in the era of fake news, don't we? Right? You can hardly believe anything you see online. It's so easy for people to change or manipulate the words or the pictures that you see. And even you don't even need to manipulate much. Right? There's people who, if you don't like what somebody says, or even if it's true, you just say fake news and you move on, right? Since the very first Easter Sunday, people have been declaring Jesus' resurrection to be fake news. Right? The disciples claimed that Jesus was alive, that they had seen him. The Jewish leaders insisted that that was fake news. Jesus was really still dead. So that raises the huge question: did Jesus really rise from the dead? Right? That's the most important question that gets to the core of what we believe as Christians. In fact, the Apostle Paul says that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul says, if Jesus Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? That's the question we all need to answer. In Matthew chapter 27, we get to hear the alternative to that. Listen to what the leaders do when the disciples claim that Jesus was alive. Matthew 27, starting at verse 62. The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and Pharisees went to Pilate. Sir, they said, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver, that's Jesus, said, after 3 days I will rise again. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first. Take a guard, Pilate answered. Go, make the tomb as secure as you know how. So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. Okay, and then at the beginning of chapter 28, we get to hear the disciples declare that Jesus is alive, that they saw him. And here's, starting at verse 11, what continues from the leaders. It says, while the women were on their way, leaving the tomb, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, you are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. There you have both Easter explanations. From the disciples, Jesus is alive. From the Jewish leaders, the disciples stole his body. Which is true? You know, over the last 2 weeks, we've talked a lot about doubts and how we have to learn to live with doubts and let them prod our faith forward, right? Because it's hard to believe the unbelievable, right? It's hard to believe that Jesus was dead and now is alive. We have to believe that without certainty, right? We don't have the certainty that Thomas had. And so we need faith to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. It's even harder to believe that he did not rise from the dead. Again, we don't have certainty, right? Nobody ever found Jesus' body. And so you need to have a lot of faith to believe that he did not rise from the dead. Let's look at some of the evidence together this morning. Let's start just by establishing two truths that nobody seriously debates. First of all, it is common knowledge, it is fully accepted that Jesus was dead. Okay, there was an argument once that, Jesus must have just been unconscious for a while. So they thought he was dead when they put him in the tomb. But really he was just unconscious. And then he woke up a few days later and he walked out of the tomb on his own power. Just a little bit of thought dismisses this option, right? Besides what it would take for unconscious Jesus to come back to consciousness, to roll the stone away for himself from the inside and to sneak past the guards unnoticed, and to do all of this after he was beaten almost to death, after he hung on a cross for hours and suffered, had a spear stuck in his side. Hard to believe. And these Roman soldiers were professional killers. They had perfected the art of torture and death. And if they had failed this miserably, if they had failed to kill somebody that they executed on a cross, somebody would have been publicly punished. But nobody was. Okay, so nobody seriously debates that Jesus was not dead. There's accounts, there's history, there's writings. Jesus really died. And secondly, nobody debates that the tomb was not empty. Everybody agrees that the tomb was empty, because it would have been so easily proven to be full if it wasn't empty, right? They used the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. He was a very well-known, important man, and everybody would have known where his family tomb was located. And so anybody could have walked there and taken a look at it and verified that it was still sealed, that it was still shut. The Jewish leaders could have told everybody, go look for yourself. They could have, even if they wanted to, opened it up and said, look, there's the body. They didn't do any of that. Instead, they made up a story saying that the disciples stole the body. And in doing so, they confirmed the truth that the tomb was empty. Remember, they would have liked nothing better than to have the tomb be full, than to have Jesus still be dead and to be able to prove it. But the evidence must have been too strong to be denied. And so they made up a story. So the question that needs to be answered, the mystery, the core mystery that needs to be solved then, is how did the tomb become empty? Right? The disciples would answer, easy. Jesus rose from the dead, just like we told you. The Jewish leaders would say, the disciples stole the body. So who's lying? And who's telling the truth? Well, there's really three possible answers to this question of how did the tomb become empty. Let's look at all three of them briefly. The first answer, yes, the disciples were lying. The disciples did steal Jesus' body. They stole his body, and then they hid it somewhere, and they made up this resurrection story, this hoax that he was alive again. And I would guess that most people in the world believe this answer. This is what most people would say. It's all a story, a hoax made up by the disciples. Let's think about this for a few minutes. First of all, think about the difficulty that they would have had stealing the body. Right? Here are 11 frightened fugitives, not trained soldiers, right? Some of them were fishermen and tax collectors. 11 frightened men taking on trained military guards, taking on the national power, the governments of Israel and Rome. Difficult to believe that these 11 untrained men could steal the body from in front of the Roman guards and could keep this body hidden forever. Nobody ever found Jesus' body. Right? And plus, the Jews and the Romans themselves made this difficult to believe. We just read, right? They made sure that this wouldn't happen. This is the last thing they wanted to have happen, that the disciples would tell the story. They'd steal the body. And so they sealed the tomb. They placed the guard. They even noted the importance of the third day and were probably paying especially close attention on day 3. Right? And these guards, they don't give any other evidence. They don't give any other story. They didn't see anyone else. They didn't hear anyone else. Hard to believe the disciples could have pulled this off. So then maybe people say, maybe it wasn't the disciples. Maybe it was somebody else who did it, somebody more trained. Well, who else could it have been? The Jews or the Romans could have done it, right? An inside job. But they had no motivation to steal the body. Remember, their goal was to end Christianity, to kill Jesus. The last thing they wanted was an empty tomb. They wanted a full tomb. So they had no motive. The other possibility is maybe it was grave robbers, right? We're told that when Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus, they buried him along with many, many expensive spices. They gave him kind of a king's burial. And so there was a lot of value to those spices. There would be motivation to break into that tomb and steal those spices. Okay, but like the disciples would have had to have done, these grave robbers would have had to get past these Roman guards. Very difficult, very unlikely. But then there's a strange thing, right? We're told that in the empty tomb, the grave clothes were left behind, all folded up nicely, right? Well, it was those spices that were attached to the cloth that had the value. So either, if you were a grave robber, either you would have taken the whole wrapped body away. You would have broken in quickly, taken everything away so you could sort out the value later on. Or if for some reason you decided to sort in the tomb while you're breaking in there, you certainly wouldn't have taken the body. You didn't care about the body, you just cared about the spices. You would have left the body behind. So it makes no sense that grave robbers could have pulled this off. It is just really difficult to see how Jesus' body could have been stolen. But let's say somehow it was. The disciples somehow pulled this off, and then they made up this story. They didn't make up a very convincing story. Right? They chose, if this is just a story, to have women be the very first witnesses to Jesus' resurrection. Remember, in that culture, women were not considered reliable witnesses. Sorry, that's just the way it was in those days. Women could not be brought as witnesses in court. They weren't seen as trustworthy. So if you were a disciple making up a resurrection story, wanting to make a convincing argument, you would have chosen a man, maybe one of the disciples themselves. The more prominent the man, the more likely the story would be believed. You want your first witness to be one that would stand up, not a woman. The only motivation to have the women be the first witnesses instead of a more reliable witness would be that this is how it happened. This is the truth. I wouldn't make this up. But finally, maybe the best evidence that the disciples really saw the risen Jesus is how they proceeded to live and how they died. We know history tells us what happened to the 11 disciples who were left. They all spent the rest of their lives telling the world that Jesus was alive. And they never changed their story, even when it cost them their lives. Right? 10 of the 11 were killed for their faith, for believing that Jesus was alive. The 11th was exiled. So for all of them, given the choice to admit that the resurrection story was a lie, that it was just a story they made up, to admit that and live, or to stand by the truth of the resurrection, to say it really happened, Jesus rose from the dead, and be tortured and die, they all chose to stand by the story, to stand by the resurrection truth, and to be beaten and crucified or stoned or beheaded for that fact. They chose to die rather than to deny that Jesus was alive. And a lie, a story, is not something people die for. People die for the truth. So whatever the disciples saw, it was a truth worth dying for. You know, it takes a whole lot of faith to believe that these 11 ragtag disciples could pull off the lie of a lifetime. It takes a lot of faith to believe that they could steal Jesus' guarded body, that they could hide it somewhere where no one would ever find it, that they could make up a resurrection story, and that they could get away with all of this without anyone ever revealing the lie. That takes a lot of faith to believe. Okay, so our first option, the disciples really were lying, and we'll put our faith in that. The second option to consider is that the disciples and the followers really did see Jesus. Right? There's 11 different times the Bible tells us that Jesus appeared to people, to men and women, to individuals, to groups, and at least once to a crowd of more than 500 people. Okay? The option is to say, yes, they did see Jesus, but they were hallucinating. They were dreaming. Just because you thought you saw something doesn't mean you really did see it. So this argument would say Jesus really was dead. He stayed dead. But they were just imagining that they saw him. Well, first of all, this argument still doesn't explain how the tomb became empty. Remember, that's a fact that everybody holds to. you still need to explain how did the tomb become empty. It also doesn't explain how these people were able to touch Jesus physically, and they were able to hear him audibly with their ears, and they were able to see him with their eyes, and they watched him eat food. These are physical actions that are not done in a hallucination, in a dream. And also, hallucinations and dreams are individual things. They happen to one person at a time, not to groups. It would be almost impossible to believe that two people would have the exact same hallucination, let alone 11 people, let alone 500 people. And if more than 500 people agreed to make up a story, agreed to tell a lie, it would be virtually impossible for all of them to keep those details consistent, for nobody to reveal that it really was a story. We all just made it up. Almost impossible to believe that they were hallucinating. It would take a lot of faith. That leaves us with our third option. Jesus really did rise from the dead. And we could spend time going through the evidence that helps point to the truth of this, right? There's 4 consistent biographies in this book that are written and confirmed by eyewitnesses. And even people who were alive at the time, they never moved these biographies to the fiction side of the library. Right? And in addition to those 4 biographies, there's letters written by eyewitnesses early enough to be disproven. Right? And these ancient letters claim that Jesus died by crucifixion and that on the 3rd day he rose again from the dead. They're not refuted by people who could have said, I saw his body. I saw the tomb was full. Nobody refutes it. And there's no proof that Jesus was still dead. No proof is given by the Jews or the Romans, who I'm sure hunted for his body, searched for him, who had every desire and every motivation to prove the resurrection false. And they couldn't do it. But it's interesting. Anybody who's going to deny number 3, anybody who's going to deny that Jesus rose from the dead, also must believe both that number 1 and number 2 that we looked at are true. You need to also believe then that the Jews or the Romans must have stolen the body, because the tomb was empty, and that needs to have some why explanation for that. And they also must believe that the disciples and his followers all hallucinated the same thing. And that needs a convincing how. Either you believe number 3 is true, or you believe both 1 and 2 also are true. We live in a time of faith, right? None of us get the certainty that Thomas had that we looked at last week, right? Whether you believe that Jesus rose or not takes faith. It takes faith to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. It takes even more faith to believe that Jesus did not rise from the dead. I am not going to pretend at all that in these few minutes we've had together, I've provided all the proof that you need, right? That you can just share this video link with anybody and they'll walk away and say, I get it. Now I understand. Now I believe. No. These few arguments and facts that I just shared with you this morning, they've been around for a long, long time. I haven't said anything new here. We can present evidence. We can think logically and lay out the logic, and many people will still not believe. Right? Remember, it's the Holy Spirit that opens eyes to see. It's the Holy Spirit who opens minds to understand. It's the Holy Spirit who opens people's hearts so that they might believe. And until the Holy Spirit works, facts will sound like foolishness to people whose hearts and minds don't want to believe. But for those of us who do want to know the truth, whose hearts and minds are open to understanding, know that God has provided evidence to point us towards what is true. Yes, it depends on faith, but there's also logic and evidence that God gives to help us point the way. So use this morning as an invitation, like we talked about last week, an invitation to explore, to ask good questions, to search for good answers. Because every single person alive will have to take a step of faith. Right? It's not a question of will you take a step of faith or not. Everybody will take a step. It's just a matter of which step of faith you will take. Will you believe that Jesus rose from the dead and take that step of faith? Or will you take the bigger step of faith, the more difficult one, and to believe that Jesus did not rise from the dead? Ask the Holy Spirit to open your heart, to open your mind, to be willing to receive what is true. Because your answer to this question makes an eternity of difference.